The sound of a single gunshot shattered the quiet afternoon. People screamed, running in every direction, while one child's body hit the ground with a thud. In the middle of the street, a police officer stood frozen, gun still smoking in his hand. His body camera's red light blinked once, then went dark. Moments later, officers rushed in, blocking the scene, pushing witnesses back and ordering silence. But one shaky cell phone video had already captured everything. A clip so shocking, so raw, it would soon explode across social media, turning an ordinary day into the beginning of a nationwide firestorm. It was an ordinary afternoon in the heart of the city. Families moved through sidewalks, cars honked impatiently, and shopkeepers shouted from open storefronts. In the middle of this everyday rhythm walked Ava Ellison, an 8-year-old girl with bright eyes and braided hair, clutching a sketchbook she had proudly filled with drawings. She was on her way home, humming softly, unaware that her innocence was about to collide with the darkest side of the system meant to protect her. Across the street, Officer Kyle Raniere scanned the crowd. He was known among colleagues for his temper, a man who carried not only a gun but also the weight of unchecked authority. To him, the city was divided into categories: safe and unsafe, compliant and threatening. And too often the ones he considered threats were children who looked like Ava. The air seemed to shift when their paths crossed. Witnesses later said the officer's hand went to his holster too quickly, his eyes narrowing as though Ava's mere presence triggered suspicion. What happened next was fast, almost too fast to process. The deafening crack of a gunshot, the sickening silence afterwards, and Ava collapsing to the pavement, her sketchbook fluttering beside her like broken wings. The police radio crackled with half-coded words, and within minutes officers formed a wall of uniforms, pushing the crowd back, silencing questions before they could spread. The most chilling part came when Officer Raniere tapped his body camera, not to check it, but to turn it off. One flick of his finger, and the only official recording of what had just occurred was gone, or so he thought. Unbeknownst to him, a figure stood at the edge of the chaos, Leroy, a homeless former combat medic. He had been sitting near a bus stop, quietly observing the street when everything unfolded before his eyes. Instead of running, Leroy lifted his cracked phone and pressed record. His footage, raw and unfiltered, would later become the evidence that authorities tried desperately to bury. Back at home, Marcus Ellison, Ava's father and a respected federal judge, was immersed in case files when his phone rang. At first, he dismissed the noise on the other end as background commotion until he caught the words, "It's Ava, she's been shot." The folder in his hand slipped to the ground. A father's worst nightmare had just arrived at his doorstep, uninvited and merciless. By nightfall, the incident was already mutating in official reports. The police statement referred to an accident, carefully avoiding Ava's name, describing her injury as minor, and framing Officer Raniere's actions as procedurally sound. To the system, Ava was becoming invisible before her wounds had even healed, yet the truth had already begun to grow wings online. Leroy's footage leaked onto social media, spreading like wildfire. The shaky video, the shocked gasps of the crowd, the clear image of a small girl lying in blood under the noon sun. No amount of official spin could erase what the world had seen. Within hours, hashtags appeared, voices rose, and what began as one man's recording ignited into a movement. This was no longer just a tragedy. It was a crime, one too big to be hidden in the shadows. The question wasn't whether people would notice. They already had. The real question was, how far would those in power go to silence the truth? The night after the shooting was heavy with silence. Hospitals are usually filled with chatter, beeping machines, and hurried footsteps. But in Ava Ellison's room, time seemed to stop. She lay pale and still, a bandage wrapped around her small shoulder. Her tiny hands clutched the sketchbook that had been stained with her blood. Nurses whispered softly outside the door, careful not to disturb her rest. Ava's eyes opened briefly, wide with fear, scanning the room as if the officer might still be there. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared into the dim light, carrying a silence that no child should ever know. Marcus Ellison stood at the foot of her bed, not as a judge, not as a man of authority, but as a father, broken and helpless. For years he had sent people to prison, believed in the law, and trusted the system. Yet tonight, the very system he had defended so fiercely was the one that had left his daughter bleeding on the ground. He wanted to scream. He wanted to demand answers. Instead, He placed a trembling hand on Ava's forehead, whispering words she could barely hear. "I'm here." "You're safe now." But deep down, Marcus knew those words were a lie. Meanwhile, inside the police headquarters, the incident report was already being rewritten. The language was polished, precise, cold. A civilian minor sustained a non-fatal injury during a crowd control procedure. Nowhere was Ava's name mentioned. Nowhere was the word child written. It was the beginning of a strategy Marcus would soon come to know as filter, lingo, the official language, designed to erase the humanity of victims. Every word was crafted not for truth, but for protection. Not for justice, but for survival. The survival of the system itself. On the streets, however, silence was breaking. Leroy, the homeless veteran who had filmed the shooting, sat on the edge of his bunk at the shelter. His phone buzzed non-stop as messages poured in. Activists, journalists, and strangers from across the country were asking for the footage. Some offered money. Others begged him not to delete it. A few warned him to be careful. Leroy stared at the cracked screen. He knew what was coming. Once this video spreads further, there would be no turning back. The police would come for him. The city would brand him a liar, but as a combat medic, he had already watched too many children die in silence. This time, he would not stay quiet. Across town, Ayla Monroe, an investigative journalist with a reputation for chasing buried truths, sat in her small office. The leaked video was already playing on her laptop. She paused it again and again, analyzing every frame. The officer's hand. The blink of the body camera light. The precise moment Ava fell, her instincts screamed that this was not just a mistake. It was deliberate. And worse, it was about to be erased. At dawn, Marcus received his first official briefing. The officer's name was omitted. The report stated Ava had been struck by a stray round. They claimed no evidence proved misconduct. Marcus closed the folder slowly, his jaw tightening. He had seen hundreds of cases twisted in similar ways. He knew this was only the beginning of a cover-up, but now it wasn't just another case. It was his daughter. As the sun rose outside the hospital, Ava opened her eyes again. She tried to speak, but only a faint whisper came out. Her lips formed a single word. Why? Marcus couldn't answer. He knew the truth. The why was bigger than one officer, bigger than one city. The why was a system built to erase her before she even had a chance to heal, and he would spend every breath left in him fighting to make sure she wasn't erased. By morning, the city was restless. The streets where Ava had been shot were no longer ordinary sidewalks. They were crime scenes in the eyes of the community. Candles and flowers appeared on the corner, along with posters bearing her name. But inside the precinct, officials were already planning how to suffocate the truth before it grew. They underestimated the internet. Leroy's video had already slipped beyond their reach. What began as a shaky upload to a private chat spread like wildfire when an activist group reshared it. The clip was raw, unedited, and devastating. It showed the officer raising his weapon. The shot. The moment Ava collapsed. And the most damning evidence of all, the officer's body camera light blinking off. Within hours, millions of people had watched it. Hashtags exploded across platforms. The words "Justice for Ava" trended worldwide, and once the video was viral, there was no taking it back. Leroy knew what that meant for him. By the time he left the shelter, 2 unmarked cars were already parked across the street. Their tinted windows tracked his every move. He ducked into an alley, clutching his phone. His hands trembled, but his decision didn't waver. He had been a soldier once. He had learned that sometimes survival wasn't about saving yourself. It was about protecting others. He whispered to himself, "Not this time. They won't bury her." Meanwhile, Ayla Monroe sat at her desk, piecing together her first article. She replayed the video frame by frame, noting the officer's stance, the bystanders' reactions, and the body camera's suspicious shutoff. Every detail was evidence. Her headline was simple but sharp. "The camera went dark. The shooting of Ava Ellison." She knew publishing this would put her career and maybe even her safety on the line. But silence, she believed, was far more dangerous. She hit publish. Within minutes, the story was everywhere. National outlets picked it up, quoting her investigation. Newsrooms debated the footage on live broadcasts. And with each retelling, the official police report looked thinner, weaker, almost laughable compared to the video the whole world had already seen. At the hospital, Marcus Ellison watched the coverage unfold. Reporters crowded outside, their voices echoing through the glass. He shielded Ava from the noise, refusing to let cameras near her room. But in his heart, he knew he couldn't shield her from what was coming. The trial in public opinion had already begun, and this time Marcus wasn't the judge. He was the grieving father whose child had become the face of injustice. The police department scrambled to respond. Their press conference was carefully staged, flags behind the podium, officers in crisp uniforms, a spokesperson with rehearsed words. They repeated the same lines. An unfortunate incident. A stray round. Pending investigation. But the crowd was no longer listening. Shouts interrupted the speech. Protesters held up phones with Leroy's video playing in loops. The truth was already louder than the lies. Late that night, Ayla received her first warning. Her office phone rang, but no one spoke. Just breathing. Then a click. Minutes later, an email arrived with no sender's name. Only 6 words glared back at her. Stop now, or she disappears next. Ayla's hands went cold. For a moment, she thought of deleting the article, walking away, pretending she had never touched the story. But then she remembered Ava's face, a child who had almost been erased before her life had even begun. Ayla closed her laptop with trembling fingers. She whispered into the darkness, "I won't stop." And somewhere across the city, Leroy hid in an abandoned warehouse, sending copies of the video to friends he trusted. He knew they would come for him soon. But even if they silenced him, the truth was already too big to bury. The system had counted on silence. Instead, it got a storm. By the 3rd day, the city was no longer calm. What had begun as quiet vigils outside the hospital had swelled into marches that stretched for blocks. Voices carried through the night, chanting Ava's name, demanding accountability. The sidewalks were painted with slogans, murals of Ava's face, and the words, "Don't erase her." The movement had grown too quickly for the police to contain. Every attempt to control the crowds, barricades, curfews, even tear gas, only added fuel to the fire. Each heavy-handed tactic was filmed and uploaded within minutes, feeding the cycle of outrage. But the loudest blow to the system didn't come from the streets. It came from within. Lieutenant Daniel Briggs sat in his small suburban kitchen staring at the news. He was a retired SWAT commander, a man who had spent decades in uniform, training officers like Kyle Raniere. He had seen mistakes before. He had seen shootings justified with clever words and technical loopholes. But this was different. An 8-year-old girl. A camera was deliberately turned off, a report scrubbed clean of her very name. For 2 nights, Briggs couldn't sleep. The weight of silence pressed on him like a stone. He knew how the system worked. Protect the badge, erase the child, bury the truth. But for the first time in his life, he refused to play along. On the morning of the protest, Briggs drove into the city. The crowd roared as he stepped onto a makeshift stage, his uniform jacket draped over one arm. Reporters turned their cameras toward him, sensing something big was about to break. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but sharp. "I wore this uniform for 30 years. I trained men like Officer Raniere. And I am telling you, what happened to Ava Ellison was not an accident. It was not a stray bullet. It was a failure. A failure of judgment, a failure of accountability, and a failure of a system designed to protect itself instead of protecting children." The crowd erupted. Briggs raised his voice above the chants. "I've buried teammates. I've seen real danger. An 8-year-old child humming to herself on a sidewalk is not in danger. She is not a threat. And the fact that her name was erased from official records, that is not a mistake. That is a cover-up." The words spread like fire. Clips of Briggs's speech went viral within hours, flooding news feeds and dominating headlines. Inside police headquarters, his betrayal sent shockwaves. Officers whispered in hallways. Some called him a traitor. Others quietly called him brave. For the first time, cracks appeared in the wall of silence. At the hospital, Marcus Ellison watched the speech on a muted television. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the screen. For days, he had felt like a lone man shouting into a storm, unheard and ignored, but now, for the first time, someone inside the system was standing beside him. Marcus felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since the shooting. Hope. Meanwhile, Ayla Monroe used the momentum to publish her second article. She paired Leroy's footage with Briggs's words, weaving a narrative too strong to dismiss. Her new headline read, "A Child Erased. A Commander Speaks. The Battle for Truth in Ava's Case." The article spread faster than the first. Every share, Every retweet, every comment, built pressure against the officials clinging to their version of the story. By nightfall, the protests grew louder, the chants echoing against government buildings. Police lines faced off with citizens who refused to leave. But this time the crowd felt different, stronger, united. Because now, they weren't just demanding justice from the outside. They had proof that even inside the walls of authority, voices were willing to tell the truth, and the system could not silence them all. Inside the hospital, the steady rhythm of machines hummed softly. Ava Ellison lay in her bed, her shoulder bound tightly in layers of bandages. Each movement made her flinch, but she never complained. She had learned to hold her pain in silence, her wide eyes revealing more than her lips ever could. Nurses said she was healing. Doctors said she was strong. But Marcus knew his daughter was carrying scars far deeper than any scan could show. Every night, he sat beside her, reading aloud from her favorite book. Sometimes she listened. Sometimes she just stared out the window. On the 5th night, she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Daddy, am I going to disappear?" Marcus's heart broke in silence. He didn't answer right away. He couldn't. Finally, he pressed her hand and said, "Not while I'm breathing." Outside the hospital, the city boiled. Protests swelled larger each day. Murals of Ava's face covered brick walls, painted by artists who had never met her, but saw her as a symbol of every erased child. Candles burned through the night, flickering against posters that read, "She Matters." But along with the voices of support came the whispers of fear. Rumors spread of activists being followed, journalists receiving late-night calls, and witnesses disappearing into silence. Leroy felt that weight more than anyone. He no longer stayed in one place for more than a night. Abandoned buildings, basements, alleys, each became his shelter. Every time he closed his eyes, he expected to wake up with police boots kicking down the door. One evening, as he slipped through a back street, he noticed a flyer taped to a wall. It carried his picture, grainy, pulled from old Army records. Across the top were the words, "Unreliable source. Do not trust." The system was trying to erase him, too. Meanwhile, Isla Monroe's work only grew bolder. Her third article exposed internal memos leaked from the department. Emails where officers discussed how to minimize damage and protect the integrity of the force. The most chilling line read, "Erase the child from the narrative." She stared at those words for a long time before publishing. She knew the risks, and sure enough, the backlash came instantly. Her inbox overflowed with threats. Cars idled outside her apartment at night, headlights flooding her windows. Still, she pressed forward. "If I stop," she whispered to herself, "then she disappears. And I won't let that happen." Marcus Ellison, too, was preparing for a battle. Though he was a federal judge, he had stepped back from the bench. The conflict of interest was obvious, but so was his determination. He studied every report, every altered word, every missing detail. The law was his weapon, and this time he would use it not as a judge, but as a father seeking justice. He began contacting allies in the legal world, gathering a team that believed in the case. Civil rights lawyers, former prosecutors, and grassroots organizers agreed to stand with him, but with each step forward, the shadows grew darker. One night, as Marcus left the hospital, a black SUV pulled up beside him. The tinted window rolled down just enough for a voice to slip through. "You've got a daughter to protect. Think carefully before you push this further." The SUV sped off, its taillights vanishing into the night. Marcus stood frozen on the sidewalk, his fists clenched. Fear pressed hard against his chest. But beneath it burned something stronger, rage, sharpened by love. He turned back toward the hospital, whispering to himself, if they want a fight, they'll get one. And in that moment, Marcus Ellison crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just a grieving father. He was a man at war with a system that had already tried to erase his child. The day of the public hearing arrived under heavy skies. Outside City Hall, the streets pulsed with energy. Thousands of protesters filled the square, their chants echoing against the stone walls. "Justice for Ava! No more silence!" Signs waved high above the crowd, and the air smelled of rain mixed with candle wax from the night-long vigil. Inside, the building carried a different kind of storm. Hushed voices, nervous glances, and cameras clicking as reporters crowded every corner. The city had never seen such tension, such pressure on a single hearing. At the center of it all was Ava Ellison. She entered slowly, holding her father's hand. A plain dress covered her small frame, the bandages beneath still healing her wound. The room fell silent when she walked in. People rose to their feet, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. The little girl they had watched collapse on a viral video was now walking into the room that would decide whether her voice was heard or erased. Marcus sat beside her, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the officials lined up across the table. They looked polished, rehearsed, their folders stacked neatly with the kind of reports designed to blur the truth. But today, those reports would face something far more powerful, Ava's truth. The first to testify was Lieutenant Daniel Briggs. His voice was steady, his words sharp. He described the training, the culture, the unwritten rules that taught officers to protect one another above all else. He admitted what others would not. We were trained to write reports that deflect blame. We were taught to see threats where none existed. And now, an 8-year-old child carries the cost of that training. Gasps rippled through the room. The officials shifted uncomfortably, but the cameras caught every word. Then came Ayla Monroe. She presented the leaked memos, reading aloud the chilling phrase, "Erase the child from the narrative." Her voice shook, not from fear, but from the weight of those words. The audience erupted, shouts of outrage cutting through the chamber. The hearing was supposed to be controlled. Instead, it became a stage where truth cracked the walls of power. Finally, it was Ava's turn. She stood slowly, her small hands clutching the edge of the podium. The microphones looked too big for her. The room leaned forward, holding its breath. For a long moment, Ava said nothing. Her lips trembled. Tears welled in her eyes. Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. Then, in a voice soft but clear, she spoke. "I was just walking home. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was singing to myself. Then he pointed at me. I heard a loud bang, and it hurt. It still hurts." Her words were simple, childlike, but they carried more weight than any legal argument. I thought maybe I was going to disappear. But I don't want to disappear. I want to go home. I want to draw again. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. By the time she finished, tears streamed down faces across the room. Even hardened reporters lowered their cameras, shaken by the rawness of her testimony. For Marcus, it was the most powerful moment of his life. Not his years on the bench. Not his court victories. But the courage of his daughter standing before the world refuses to vanish. As the hearing adjourned, the chants outside grew louder. The crowd had heard her words through live broadcasts, and they repeated them in unison. "I don't want to disappear." That day, Ava's voice became more than testimony. It became a movement, and the system, no matter how powerful, could no longer pretend she did not exist. The city was not the same after the hearing. For weeks, the chants outside City Hall echoed across the nation. Ava's soft voice had traveled farther than anyone imagined, played on news channels, replayed in classrooms, and quoted on protest banners. Her words, "I don't want to disappear," became the heartbeat of a growing movement. What began as one child's testimony now spread into every corner of the country. People who had once been silent found themselves speaking up. Communities shared stories of other children erased by the system. Families long ignored stepped forward, holding photos of sons and daughters whose names had never made it into official reports. Ava's scar had become more than a wound. It had become a symbol. Inside his office, Marcus Ellison stared at stacks of papers that had overtaken his desk. Legal petitions, reform proposals, community letters, all addressed to him. To the world, he was the father who refused to let his daughter vanish. To the system, he was now a threat. But Marcus had made his choice. He resigned from the federal bench. His letter was short, almost cold, but every word carried weight. Justice is not served by silence. I cannot remain a judge in a system that erases its victims. I will fight as a father, as a man, and as a citizen until no child is invisible again. The resignation shook the legal community. Some called it reckless, others called it heroic. But Marcus didn't care. He had watched his daughter bleed in the street, watched her whisper fears no child should carry. Titles meant nothing now. Only truth mattered. Leroy, the homeless veteran who had risked everything to release the video, was not forgotten either. Community leaders raised money to help him find stability. For the first time in years, he had a bed of his own. But more than that, he had dignity again. He told reporters, "I didn't save her. She saved us. She reminded us of what we were blind to. I just made sure the world saw it." Ayla Monroe's articles turned into a book deal, but she didn't stop there. She continued publishing, exposing cover-ups across the country. For every threat she received, she replied with another piece of truth. In her words, "If Ava can speak, so can I. And Lieutenant Daniel Briggs, the retired commander who had broken the code of silence, became a voice for reform inside police culture. He traveled city to city urging officers to reject the mindset of fear and secrecy. Some hated him for it. Others secretly thanked him. He knew change would be slow, maybe even incomplete, but it had to start somewhere. For Ava, life moved quietly forward. Her wound healed, but the scar remained. A small mark etched into her skin, visible whenever she wore short sleeves. At first she hated it. She would tug at her shirt, trying to cover it, afraid it made her different. But one evening, as she sketched in her notebook, Marcus sat beside her and said, "That scar means you're still here. It means they tried to erase you, but they couldn't. It means you won." From then on, Ava no longer hid it. She wore it openly, even proudly. When classmates asked, she didn't shrink. She answered softly, "It's my reminder not to disappear." Months later, a new law was passed requiring all police body cameras to stay on during interactions with minors. Schools introduced programs teaching children their rights, using Ava's story as a case study. Activists formed organizations in her name dedicated to protecting children from state violence. No law, no reform, no movement could erase the trauma of what happened. But step by step, Ava's story was building something larger, a refusal to let silence win. On the anniversary of the shooting, the community gathered in the same square where the first protests had begun. Murals of Ava now covered entire buildings, her face painted alongside the words, "I am still here." She stood on stage beside her father, small in stature, but enormous in presence. The crowd hushed as she stepped to the microphone. Her voice was stronger now, steadier than the first time she had spoken. "I'm not gone. I'm not erased. And I won't stop speaking until no child is ever erased again." The crowd erupted, their chants rolling like thunder through the city. As the sun dipped low, Marcus placed his hand on Ava's shoulder. He no longer wore the robes of a judge. He no longer carried the authority of the courtroom, but he carried something far greater, the knowledge that his daughter had survived, and that her voice had reshaped a nation. And though the road ahead would be long, Marcus Ellison knew one truth with certainty. Ava had not disappeared. She had become a light. If you enjoy these stories, make sure to subscribe to Black Battlers so you never miss the next one. Your subscription gives us the power to bring you even more emotional and inspiring stories. Join the Black Battlers family today.